Hello everyone, welcome to our sixth self-defense video. My name is Emily Hull, I'm the instructor for this series, and today we will be talking about the legal limitations on self-defense. So for today, I want to start off with some important definitions that we need to know before we get into self-defense law. Then we'll move on to how we justify our use of force under the defense of self-defense. Then we'll talk about some types of self-defense laws, specifically what types of laws we have here in Kansas. And then I've provided some links at the end for further education, so I'll talk a little bit about those when we get there. So first, let's start with potentially the most important definitions in the self-defense legal world, self-defense versus retribution. So our definition of self-defense here is the use of force to defend oneself. That seems pretty self-explanatory. However, it turns to retribution when it's punishment imposed for purposes of repayment or revenge for a wrong committed. So there's a very fine line between self-defense and retribution and revenge, and that's what we want to be careful of. We don't want to cross that line, otherwise we're not going to be justified under the defense of self-defense. Now, when I say the defense of self-defense, I mean if an individual was in a self-defense situation where their life was threatened and they used some form of force, usually that will result in both parties being held accountable. So at that point, you find yourself in a court of law after using force, and you have to use the defense of self-defense to justify your use of force. So a definition for that is part 2 under self-defense here. An affirmative defense as to a murder charge, for example, alleging that the defendant used force necessarily to protect themselves because of a reasonable belief that the other party intended to inflict great bodily harm or death. So basically what this means is it's a defense that you can use in the court of law, saying that you were justified in your use of force because it was necessary to protect yourself because of a reasonable belief that you were in great danger. So keep these in mind as we continue talking. One of our important distinctions in self-defense is that we want to stop at that line of what is necessary to end the threat. We don't want to cross over into that other realm of retribution, because that's a whole can of worms of trouble that you'll get into if you go beyond what is necessary to end that threat. So just keep that in mind. So the defense of self-defense, a little bit more on that. It's a defense to criminal charges because you say you're justified. Courts recognize the importance of allowing citizens to defend themselves using reasonable force. Generally, the courts don't like us being out there and using physical force against each other. However, they recognize the importance of allowing us to defend ourselves against whoever that may be if our life is in danger. The important part there is using reasonable force. Again, we don't want to cross that line. To use the defense of self-defense, you have to meet all criteria. There has to be an imminent threat to your life. You have to feel that your life is in danger. It has to be a reasonable fear. You can't make up some excuse for why you felt like your life was in danger. That's usually an objective standard. And proportional force. Again, we do not want to cross that line. So there are a couple tools that we can use to help us with this. Where's the line drawn between self-defense and retribution? I'm gonna give the good lawyer answer. It depends. So these are two acronyms, two sets of principles that can be used to justify self-defense. So IMOP was the original. It was created by Rory Miller in his book Facing Violence. It was kind of the first standard. You know, you have to fit all 4 of these principles to justify your use of force. However, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, it's transitioning more to the AOJ principles. They're very similar, but they do have some differences, and that's why we're transitioning to AOJ. So let's start with IMOP. Intent means opportunity and preclusion. Intent. Does this person intend to cause harm? A knife held by a chef in a kitchen could cause a lot of harm to somebody, but if that chef is just cutting vegetables, they don't intend to hurt anybody, so you are not justified in using force. It sounds like a silly example, but it illustrates the principle well. Means, can this person physically cause harm? Think of an angry 5-year-old. We're probably not too terribly worried about this 5-year-old causing bodily injury to us, right? How do things change then when that 5-year-old now has a very pointy knife? Maybe we aren't using dangerous physical force against this 5-year-old with a knife, but still, you would be more justified in using restrictive force or potentially physical force if they're that strong of a threat. Opportunity. Does this person have the opportunity to cause harm? If I'm on this side of a brick wall and the aggressor is on the other side of the brick wall and they can't get through, they don't have the opportunity to harm me. However, if they're standing 5 feet in front of me, I would be much, much more justified in my use of force. The P stands for preclusion. Have you done everything in your power to avoid the use of force? This is the part about IMOP that gets a little sticky because this doesn't apply in every case depending on which state you're in. I'll talk about that more when we get to the types of laws, but for now, just know that preclusion is, have you done everything in your power to avoid the use of force? Did you run? Did you try to de-escalate? Did you lock the door? Things like that. And if you've done everything you can do safely, then you are justified in moving forward with your use of force. So that's kind of the older one. Preclusion is kind of sticky. That's why we are transitioning to the AOJ principles. You can see with the blue and green highlights here that these are very similar. Ability and opportunity are basically the same things as means and opportunity. The only thing that's different is the last one, jeopardy. Does your life appear to be in danger to a reasonable person? That's back on this slide where we talk about there has to be reasonable fear to that imminent threat. There has to be reasonable fear for it. So jeopardy, does your life appear to be in danger to a reasonable person? Now remember, it has to be to a reasonable person. That can vary based on who your judge is, who your attorneys are, things like that for it to be reasonable. However, if you have a weapon pointed at you, that's your life is in jeopardy at that point. So that's harder to say that's harder to dispute jeopardy versus something that maybe wasn't so serious, maybe wasn't such in grave danger. That's where that reasonable piece can get a little tricky. But right now we generally side with the AOJ principles over IMOP for this next slide. So there are two main types of self-defense laws. The first is duty to retreat. This is an example from the Arkansas State Code that says a person may not use deadly physical force in self-defense if the person knows that he or she can avoid the necessity of using deadly physical force with complete safety by retreating. So basically what this means is you are not justified in using force in self-defense if you know that you can avoid having to use that force by retreating. That sounds a lot like preclusion, and that's why we are moving away from the IMOP principles, is because duty to retreat states may have preclusion, but this next type of law, stand your ground states, do not require preclusion. So Kansas is a stand your ground state, as you can see here from the Kansas State Code. So a person is justified in the use of force against another when and to the extent it appears to such person and such person reasonably believes that such use of force is necessary to defend such person or a third person against such other's imminent use of unlawful force. I'm telling you, the Kansas legislature loves the word such. Basically what this means is you're justified in using force against another person if you reasonably believe that that use of force is necessary to defend yourself or a third person against this person's use of unlawful force. And then part C is what makes it the stand your ground law. So nothing in this section shall require a person to retreat if such person is using force to protect such person or a third person. basically nothing requires you to retreat. You have no requirement for preclusion if you are using force to protect yourself or a third party. So that's why we're kind of getting away from that IMOP and we're transitioning to AOJ. Is stand your ground states do not require a duty to retreat. And Kansas is a stand your ground state. So preclusion is not necessarily as important for stand your ground states. My point with that is if you do everything in your power to remove yourself from the situation, if you do hit that preclusion piece, then that's going to make you more likely to be justified even in a stand your ground state. So if you do everything in your power and you say, listen here, I tried to de-escalate and none of it worked, so then I resorted, even if you're in a stand your ground state, that will still give you points. And that will still make it more likely that you will be justified because it shows that you did not necessarily want to use that force. You didn't want to get in the altercation. But even in a stand your ground state, it's sometimes important to make that point, and you still might want to be covered on that. So that's just something to keep in mind when thinking about self-defense and your personal principles. Also what you're comfortable with. I know that I would likely try to remove myself from the situation first and try to remove myself from that situation before using force. I'm a smaller individual and I know that I may have a better chance of removing myself than I would by using force. So that's just something to ask yourself about, what you're comfortable with and what your state's laws are. Now, there is a third type of self-defense law called the Castle Doctrine, and I call it special because even in duty to retreat states, this is usually still in those statutes. So basically the Castle Doctrine is extending stand your ground to the person's home. Usually it's just home. As you can see here in Kansas, it extends to place of work or occupied vehicle, but it stems from the idea that a man's castle or a man's home is his castle. So you have the right to defend your home from any unlawful entry. So in the Kansas Code, it says a person is justified in the use of force against another when and to the extent it appears, and you reasonably believe that the use of force is necessary to prevent another person from unlawfully entering into your dwelling, which is your home or your apartment, things like that, place of work, or occupied vehicle. So Kansas goes a little bit farther, like I said. Some states, especially duty to retreat states, it's just your house, but Kansas goes to place of work or occupied vehicle as well. And basically what this is saying is if you reasonably believe someone is trying to enter your home unlawfully, then you're justified in using force. It goes up a step, it escalates a step in Part B here. A person is justified in the use of deadly force to prevent or terminate unlawful entry upon any dwelling, place of work, or occupied vehicle if they reasonably believe that such use of deadly force is necessary to prevent death or bodily harm. So if you believe that not only they are entering your home, but instead of taking your stuff, they're there to hurt you, then you are justified another level to potentially deadly force. Now, it's still good to keep in mind those principles we talked about, because if you don't check off those things, then you still might be questionable on your justification, but you are more justified if you are in your home and somebody is unlawfully entering. And then again, we have the Part C, nothing in the section shall require you to retreat if you're using force to protect your dwelling, place of work, or occupied vehicle. Now, this is actually quite common, even in duty to retreat states. In the Castle Doctrine statute, usually there will be something removing the duty to retreat, even in generally duty to retreat states. Because it is your home. If somebody is breaking into your home and you are here with your family, there is nothing saying that you need to leave your place of residence, because if you leave, you could be even in more danger. And a man's home is his castle. That's what this is built off of. You have the right to protect your home and defend it as if it were your castle. So some states have stronger castle doctrine laws, everybody jokes about Texas, you know, a toe over the line, and you have, I mean, you have some very strong shotgun level force pointed at you. It is a joke. I don't think it's actually that strong. But some states, especially duty to retreat states, have a much weaker standard. Kansas is kind of in the middle, not nearly as much as Texas, but it's also extending to place of work or occupied vehicle. So with that, that's all the content that I have prepared for today. I did put together some more resources here if that's something that you're interested in, looking into more self-defense laws, digging deeper. There are weapons self-defense laws. We'll get into those further into June. Not talking about those right now because it does get a lot more complex. However, if you want to look at the Kansas code, I recommend this Find Law link here. The Kansas legislative website is the least user-friendly website I think I've ever seen. So Find Law is a good place to look for those codes. If you're interested in other states, they also have those there as well. I cannot emphasize enough. If you're from Kansas, if you're from Missouri, if you're from California, know what your laws are because they do change state to state. So if you go to KU, but your residence is in California, know both of those laws. I covered Kansas today because I'm from Kansas, and as a KU entity, most people watching these videos are likely in Kansas. However, if you live in another state or you are frequently in another state, please, please, please know your laws, know your rights, because we don't want to use force thinking it's justified, but then find out we're in a duty to retreat state and we didn't check off that preclusion. We definitely don't want that to happen because that's a very bad situation legally. If you would like an overview of self-defense laws, stand your ground, duty to retreat, and how it looks across the board, how many states have which types of laws, I would highly recommend going to this second website here. It seemed to have a very nice overview. So if you're looking for more general, then I would go there, but please, please, please know your laws. It's very important. The last thing I want to talk about today is these real discussions on self-defense laws. So just because each state has their own set of laws and they're kind of tailored to that state does not mean they are not controversial. So these are some cases here that are demonstrating the controversies between duty to retreat and stand your ground. There are benefits and drawbacks of both. And it's important to know those before forming opinions of which one you like better. I will warn you, because these are real cases, if you go down the rabbit hole and start looking at these, and even in these articles here, there could be potentially disturbing content because these usually deal with weapons, and while it changes a little bit, the general premise is still the same, but I just wanted to warn, the details can be a little gruesome. So the first one here is a murder case in Indiana, challenging their self-defense law and what is constituted as self-defense. The second bullet point here is a summary of the long-standing controversy between duty to retreat and stand your ground. And then the last one, I didn't put a link down because it's such a hot topic and so controversial right now. I could not find an unbiased source, but it's the Ahmaud Arbery shooting. So in February, there was a young man on a jog and he was shot. The facts of that case are still up in the air. Again, it's very controversial. Everyone has their own opinion of the facts, and that's not the way that it should be, but it's the state that we're in with this case right now. So one of the things that I found interesting is the people who shot Ahmaud are now claiming self-defense. And I've seen the video, I've analyzed the facts, and if you do the same and come up with a different conclusion, I would love to hear from you. However, I will say, I don't know if the defense of self-defense is viable in this case. Based on the facts that have been laid out and in the video, again, I encourage you to find your own conclusion. but at least mine is that I'm leaning towards the not viable side. So with that being said, if with any of these things you would like to discuss, or you have questions over these cases, or want to know my opinion on things, I would be happy to answer those questions and have that discussion with you. Again, I encourage you to look into these and formulate your own opinions, your own conclusions, and see what's going on with the law. And then if you think that it's justified or not. And some of these things are very, very slippery. That's generally the way that legal stuff is. And there's a lot of gray area. So I would love to hear your opinions. I would love to have discussions with you about this. You all know my email. So if you would like more information, if you have any questions that I didn't cover today over the types of self-defense laws, the principles, things like that, or if you want to discuss one of these cases, then by all means reach out. I love hearing from you, and let me know what your thoughts are. So that's all I have for you today. I apologize, this video was maybe a little bit longer than I was hoping it would be, but I think I've covered all of my bases. Reach out if you have any questions, and thank you for joining me today. I hope this was super informative. I have a soft spot in my heart for legal issues, and so being a martial artist, this is right up my alley. So thank you for joining me today. Again, questions, comments, let me know, and I hope to see you next week. We'll get started on some physical self-defense, up and moving, learning some techniques. So thank you. We'll see you next week.